One of the tenets of the pillars of conscious capitalism is conscious leadership. And our next speaker has dedicated his life to truly understanding what that means. And he doesn't only understand it, but he has made it measurable, and so therefore given us the tools to actually be able to develop it step by step. So Bob Anderson has really dedicated his life to, to explaining what's the journey of becoming a conscious leader, and he'll be sharing with us not only the skills, but also what is behind it on a being level and on a mindset level. He's the chairman and the founder of the Leadership Circle, and I wish, us all an enjoyable hour, and please give a warm welcome to Bob Anderson.
Thank you very much. I can see many of you have your tables in front of you, so you may not want to stand up, but if you can stand up, I want you to just stand up. If you can, I want you to turn to a partner near you. Just turn to a partner near you, and for 1 minute, talk to each other about what struck you from Raj's conversation. Just one or two thoughts that struck you about his conversation. 1 minute. Workshops are meaningful discussions interrupted by lecture, so let's get started. So thank you. It's really, I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to be here. I was telling my wife last night, I think I've prepared my whole life for this presentation. And I think as you see how I launch into this, you'll get a sense for why. So is Raj still here? Is he still here? If you haven't read the book, you need to read the book. I've read a lot of leadership literature, it's what I do, and much of it doesn't touch me anymore, but this book really moved me. It's a great book. It's the future of leadership. As I watched it, this sort of warm feeling came over me, and I didn't quite know where to place it, and I was reading, and I'm going along, and said, what is this? And it felt like coming home to something I've known my whole life. And then I realized I grew up in a conscious business. This is my family business. It was started by my grandfather and my grandmother and my uncles and aunts and dad. It's called the Andersons. It's an agribusiness, started in the 40s. And it was a conscious business. It was founded on a statement of principles that was a living, breathing, working document, constantly being referenced. It was a large operation. But the statement of principles, I went back and reread it after years. I haven't worked there for years. Statement of principles reads like the book. It starts with core foundational beliefs and principles on which we found this business and what it stands for. Then it moves on to how we want to treat our customers, how customers get exquisitely served. And you can see this in the integration of stakeholders that he talks about, because it moves on to talk about employees and the kind of conscious culture that was deliberate intention. This is in the 40s and 50s. It's amazing, really. In fact, the organization was not unionized, and at one point the union made a particularly aggressive effort to unionize the organization. And in fact, it got violent at one point. They were blowing up railroad tracks, and they actually hired some thugs to come by and do drive-by shootings into the houses of our families at night. My uncles and dads gathered and said, are we going to put our lives at risk for the principles we believe in here? And the answer was yes. And unbeknownst to us at the time, the employees were gathering, and they took out a full-page ad in the newspaper to declare why they didn't want or need a union. The kind of well-paid, well-treated, love the company, here's why we don't need a union. That ended it. It's never been unionized. It's been a profitable business, became a Fortune 500 business, and it's... Then, of course, then you go on, and it's about the integration stakeholders in the very same way that Raj just talked about it. So I grew up in this. I started my career here. That makes hog food and dog food. That's what I did. That's how I started my career, right? In that plant. It was the most technologically advanced plant in the country at the time it was built in 1970s. And we were in startup, which was code for nothing worked, right? So here I am, the plant's down again, and it's late at night, it's about 2 in the morning. I'm outside in the receiving bay dumping railroad cars full of feed ingredients to get the plant stocked so we can get it back online. I crawl inside the railroad car, I'm sweeping out the last bit of feed ingredients. I got my dust mask on my mouth. I prop my feet up in the bottom of the hopper car just to catch my breath. And out of my mouth, completely unrehearsed, completely unreflected, came, "I'm not becoming who I am." And I said it loud, I said it authoritatively, and I looked at myself, well, where did that come from? Who said that? And I realized in that moment that I had just spoken a truth I couldn't go back on. I didn't know what it meant, but it started a journey that led me here. See, I've cared my whole life about one thing: conscious leadership. How do we tap the deep wellspring of extraordinary being that's in each one of us and draw it forth and put it in service of something worthy of our deepest commitments and lead from there? And so we started with a definition when I got into this work with a kind of description of self-leadership. Leadership is the deployment of self into circumstances. So one of our clients put it this way: leaders bring the weather. You know as soon as the leader walks in the room what kind of weather it is today, right? Leaders bring the weather, and the deployment, leadership is the deployment of self into circumstances. You are your primary asset for transforming whatever's happening in the moment. And so our working definition of self-leadership is creating outcomes that matter most. How can we step into the moment, or even step into our lives, and create results, outcomes that we care about, care deeply about? How can our life step in and through us to create the kind of organizations we believe in, to create the kind of families that we care about, and so on and so on? And if we can do that, we think that's a pretty good start on what it means in terms of self-leadership. And that's a prerequisite to this notion of conscious leadership, or to leadership in general in terms of a higher form of it. So it's a prerequisite. Our working definition on leadership is scaling that in the organization. So scaling the capacity and capability of the organization to create what matters most. And how do we do that? And to scale, most of us, if we work in organizations, want it to scale, want it to grow. And you do that best by, we think, scaling leadership, and I think best by scaling more conscious leadership, especially because we live in this world now. You're all familiar probably with VUCA. It was an acronym that was coined by Bob Johansen, one of the foremost futurists in the world. We know Bob well. And he said the world is becoming increasingly, at an accelerating rate, more volatile, more uncertain, more complex, and more ambiguous. And I would say more disruptive. And we talked to him recently. He said we haven't seen anything yet. The level of disruption that's coming at us is unparalleled. So this is the world we live in. And the organizations we see that are really creating a unique response to it are trying to create organizational structures and cultures that are more agile, more adaptive, more resilient, more engaging. In other words, they're trying to create a conscious business. You don't create this kind of organization without conscious leadership and without the conscious culture and integration of stakeholders and the higher purpose. You do not create this kind of organization otherwise. And so I think when I read your book, Raj, it was like, this is the future of leadership, those organizations that are most consciously led are much more likely to thrive in the current complexity that we now face. It's a business imperative. And of course, Raj, I just pulled some pages out of the book. You know, you've seen the data he presented. It's like conscious businesses, 2.5 times, 3.5 times the market, and even the good to great companies in the same complexity we're in over the last 15 years. And so I want to talk directly about consciousness today. What is it? It's a fuzzy word. It's not a business word. And I want to start with a premise that we hold close at our company, that the organization, our organization, your organization, will not perform at a higher level of performance than the consciousness of its leadership. So we think consciousness and effectiveness are related. We think consciousness and performance are related. And it's a journey. Don't underestimate it. It's heroic. That's why in the mythology it's called the hero's journey, and I want to come back to that. So let's just jump in. Mastery at anything, doesn't matter whether it's golf or music or arts or leadership. Mastery at anything is a well-practiced, well-honed outer game arising on a highly mature inner game. And when you put those two together, performance becomes extraordinary, masterful. You're working. As you work, deployment of self into circumstances, you are working an outer game and inner game simultaneously. So the outer game of your experience, your knowledge, your skills, your competencies, what you're bringing to the moment, all of that is your outer game, and you have to continually get better at that. But that game is being mediated by an invisible game, the inner game. How you're perceiving the moment, how you're taking it in, what meaning you're making of it, how you're processing it, your level of emotional intelligence in relationship to it, self-awareness in relationship to it, the mental models you bring to that moment, the kind of core assumptions that run your identity, who you take yourself to be and how you have to be in that moment in order to be seen as credible and valuable and successful and so on. All of that is going on. That's the inner game. The inner game runs the outer game. The inner game of consciousness, we think, runs the outer game. It's the deep structure of performance. Structure determines performance. And so the definition that I have of consciousness is it's the operating system of performance. I love the metaphor of an operating system because we all remember what it's like to work with DOS, right? Some of us are too young to remember this. This is actually, when you turned on your computer, this is what it looked like. And it was amazing. We went, wow, look what we can do with this now. And of course, here's the metaphor. It wasn't complex enough for the complexities we were going into. It was really clunky, right? And we were amazed when Windows came along. Wow. And then, of course, Windows 8, Windows 10, right? Of course, I'm a Mac man. It's the same thing there, right? But here's the metaphor. With each leap-step evolution in the structure of the operating system, we were able to do what? More with less. Take on more complex tasks with greater artistry, greater agility, greater mastery, greater creativity, more fun. And this is why Microsoft and Apple are constantly working to upgrade the inner game of their computers, the operating system. I also love it because it's a structural metaphor. Structure determines performance. Everything you saw in that plant that I showed you, my dad designed. And I grew up in his workshop. So I learned really early that the design of something is the primary determinant of its performance. So if you take that to consciousness, I'm designed perfectly for the performance I'm getting. Your business is designed perfectly for the performance it's getting. So structure determines performance, and consciousness is a structure that evolves through stages like DOS, Windows 10. Bob Keegan, the foremost researcher on stages of consciousness development, stages of adult development, Harvard University, just retired from Harvard University, has a 3-stage model that we have incorporated into our work with leaders. I don't have a lot of time to unpack this, but when I first came across it in the 90s, having spent 20 years trying to integrate the field of leadership, when I first came across this, it blew me away. It literally reframed everything I thought I knew about leadership. It explains a ton about what makes leadership grow into more and more extraordinary levels and how that happens. And of course, the basic principle is that the inner game runs the outer game. So as consciousness matures through various stages, then leadership shows up differently. Deployment of self into circumstances is very, very different. And so we have a model of reactive leadership moving to creative leadership, moving to integral leadership. It's not exactly that neat, but the basic notion is that how you're showing up in your outer game has everything to do with how you've designed your inner game. And so I want to just talk about this briefly. There's a lot happening here. We could spend all morning here. What I want you to get is that this is a journey, and it's a complex journey, and it's a hard-earned journey, and it's actually measurable. And there's been a lot of research on how it actually proceeds and what it looks like when it does proceed. And so time frames, for example, expand. So when we start out our careers, most of us in a reactive structure of mind, that's early stage, our time frame is very short, weeks, months. And we're focused on projects and problems, goals, seeking solution in a shorter term time frame. And this is our operating system. And then if it expands, if it moves into the next phase, we now, this gets to higher purpose, we now begin to get captured by a vision that we care about. Not one that's prescribed for us, but one that we're starting to own as our own. And we're building strategy, longer-term strategy, in order to bring into being an organization we believe in. And then if it moves on again, time frames move out, and now we're talking decades, maybe longer, and we're into the integration and optimization of all the stakeholders in the ecosystem of our business. So we're literally become servants of the system, architects of the system that can optimize the welfare of not only our business and all the stakeholders, but the entire ecosystem that our business touches. And this is systems thinking. It's a very powerful way of leading, and it's very well adapted for the kind of complexity we're in. Only 5% of leaders are operating here. Underneath all that is the inner game is also evolving, and the inner game has to evolve in order for the outer game to evolve. And so when we start, we're in what Keegan called a socialized mind. In other words, we're living up to the conditions. We're living from our conditioned mind. We're living what we call outside in. You define me. Your expectations drive me. I'm trying to live up to the expectations of others. So I'm actually authored by others more than I am myself at this point. And that is inherently, as Covey said, dependent, meaning I depend on outside validation for my sense of security, self-worth, self-esteem, and so on. And Larry Wilson called this a play not to lose game, meaning I'm actually trying to forward my objectives by not disappointing you, by not falling short, by not failing, by being the smartest guy in the room and trying to live up to that expectation. So I'm actually in a play not to lose, run by fear game, chasing down crises and problems as fast as I can. Good reactive operating system. If it moves on, and that's a big if, we move into more self-authored. Here, less dependent on what you want from me. I'm much more focused on how I can bring out this emerging vision and sense of purpose and create a life and an organization around it. And so it's a play on purpose game. If it moves on, Bob Kagan calls this self-transforming, because now you have the capability to be not only self-transforming, you know how to work the pathways of transformation, but you are a transformative influence around you. There is less separation between you and the system. The dysfunction and function that's out there is now in me. I can hold all the different parts of myself, the dark, the light, the masculine, the feminine, the good, the bad. Oh, really? Okay, I'm going to die an imperfect being. Let's get on with it. And then, if I can hold that with self-compassion, I can hold the rest with self-compassion, right? What's going on out there, we can actually hold in a dialogue. Tensions in opposites, integration of competing stakeholder commitments, and optimize it in a higher order solution where a rising tide lifts all boats. And frankly, we have to be able to do this if we're going to solve the problems that Raj was talking about this morning. We can't get there except through more conscious leadership. I think where this book is pitched and where this movement is pitched is at reactive or higher. And 80% of adults are measuring and operating from a more reactive mindset. So we're in a development gap. Reactive mindset's not adapted for the kind of complexities we're in. It's mismatched to VUCA, and it won't create a conscious business. It just can't boot up on that. And so how do we then scale conscious leadership? You want to scale a conscious business, you got to scale the leadership. None of this happens without conscious leadership. So how do you scale it in an organization? How do you be the kind of leader that can scale that in an organization? That's where the leadership circle comes in. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but a lot of our research that I want to show you comes through the lens of this assessment, so I want to give you a sense for it. It's a 360 assessment. Everybody familiar with those? You know, you get feedback from a bunch of people and so on, but it's of a different kind. It's built on 2 operating systems, so that if you notice the language, bottom half is reactive, top half is creative, built on this framework of development. This would be an optimal profile. Now, many of you don't know the leadership circle, so let me just give you a thumbnail sketch of it. So, top half, key creative competencies. 18 key competencies in the outer circle that are well researched in the field. The field has done a lot of work here to dial in, here's what works. So these are 18 key competencies that are highly correlated to leadership effectiveness, business results, and so on. And here's our data on it. Down here is an average score of the top half. Take all 18 competencies, put the average score together, correlate it against a measure of leadership effectiveness that's on our assessment, and this is the correlation, 0.93. High or low? Pretty high. It doesn't get much higher in this kind of research. In other words, if you can move the needle on the top half of the circle and grow your creative competency, then you're likely to be seen as a much more effective leader. Highly likely. Bottom half, reactive leadership. This is, hear the language, these are not weaknesses. These are strengths being run through reactive mind. And when we run our strength in a play not to lose game, it has liabilities associated with it. I may have a natural gift at driving for results, but when I'm compulsively tied to that, I overdrive it and leave people in my wake. And so our data on reactive leadership is inverse to effectiveness, and very strongly so. So the stronger my scores in the bottom half of the circle, the more likely it is that I'm going to be seen as ineffective, experienced as ineffective. Now, what makes you were economist, right? Economics, studied economics, business? I thought you did.
Well, business PhD, a little bit of it.
Economics, right? So I was undergrad in economics. I love models. That's why I think I created this, actually. So you all know supply and demand, right? Supply goes up, demand stays constant. What happens to price? Down. We all know this, right? It's a dynamic model. Things move. There's 3 variables there. They all move together. Same as with this. Every time something moves in the bottom half, something is likely to move in the top half because the bottom half of the circle is inverse to the top half of the circle. So as you get stronger scores in the reactive, you're going to see lower corresponding energy in the top half of the profile. Follow that? It's a very dynamic, integrated model. Now, that's all you need to know. Here's a perfect profile. Scores radiate from center. Green is the feedback from others. Black is the self-score. This is my profile. I just wanted to put this out there. Let's make no mistake about it. Not. So, but here's where we got this. This is actually, we've asked about 80-some thousand, I don't know what the number is now, around the world to describe optimal leadership through this lens. Here's the question we ask them, and it relates to the VUCA world we're in. What's the kind of leadership that, if it existed in your organization, would allow it to thrive in its current marketplace and into the future? And this is the picture we get. Consistently. All over the world. Some variation in developing countries, but it's uncanny. So here's the thing. We've heard that leadership is the most studied and least understood of subjects. You've heard this. McGregor said it years ago. I don't think that's true anymore. I actually think the field has figured out what works. And when we ask managers, they tell us what works. We looked at it another way. We created a business metric, perceptual metric. We said asking managers to evaluate the performance of a business. So things like market share, profitability, sales, revenue, quality of products and services, and so on. Overall business performance. We created a business metric and we correlated it to the measures on our survey, but in this case, correlated to leadership effectiveness scale on the survey. And here's what we got. So high correlation, positive correlation between how the business is performing and how the leader is deploying him or herself into circumstances. Now, get what we're here. This is perceptual. So what we're seeing is a worldwide perception on the relationship between how you show up in leading your business and how that business is functioning or performing relative to industry standards. Then we got curious about this. We said, I wonder what the aggregate leadership profile, the average leadership profile is for the businesses that were most highly rated, right? Top 10%. Well, we couldn't resist the second question. What's the average score? What's the average profile for the businesses that were bottom 10%? Here's what we found. This is the aggregate leadership profile for those businesses, for the leaders in the businesses that were evaluated as top 10% on business performance. Here's the aggregate leadership profile of businesses that were rated as underperforming, bottom 10%. Notice a difference? Huge difference. There's a lot we could say here, but the basic premise is that we think creative leadership carries the day here in terms of performance, and that underperforming businesses, we're going to see much more of a tendency toward reactive styles of leadership. This relates directly to conscious business and to the journey of conscious leadership. We got a book coming out, probably in February, calling it Leadership at Scale. In it, we did a study of our written comments We have over 1.5 million surveys now, people around the world. We said, I wonder how leaders actually talk about this stuff. So how do leaders talk to other leaders when they're giving each other feedback about what they're doing that's working and what they're doing that's not working, and what can we learn from that? So we looked at senior leaders. I don't have time to get into all the study. We could be here another couple hours on that. It amazed us. So I want to just give you a couple of looks at this. So here's what we did. We sampled our norm base, our database. We did a number of samples, but I'm going to talk about the two extremes on one end, the most reactive and the most creative, 28% on each end. We sampled that group, senior leaders. And here's the aggregate profile of the high creative group. Here's the aggregate profile of the high reactive group. Right? See any difference? Right? Big difference. Now, we sampled for that, so it's not a surprise. We would expect this. But here's the thing. When I talked with Jennifer Garvey-Berger, for example, who's one of the foremost on adult development in the world, and some others that are, they said, we would expect to see in this group an upwardly biased sample of more conscious leaders. Those people that use both the leadership circle and measures of adult development would expect to see this. We didn't measure that, but that's the notion here. So this is the picture of a more conscious leader versus one that's less conscious. Now, here's the picture of their effectiveness scores. In the high creative leader group, the average leadership effectiveness score was averaged at the 87th percentile, which means higher than 87% of our 1.5 million surveys. Whereas on the creative group, or on the reactive group, it was at the 10th percentile. But what astonished our statisticians was the effect size score. Now, I don't even know what that means. It's a statistical black box to me. So here's what they tell me it means. It means that we're trying to measure, would these groups show up in the workplace differently? Would we notice a difference between these two groups? An effect size score of 0.3, the answer is yes. We would see a difference. At 0.8, a statistician would say large, meaningful differences. The difference in effectiveness scores on these samples is what, 4.4. So these groups couldn't be more different in the way they're showing up. Which is also, I don't have time to get into this and show you the data, but when we looked at all the comment data, it was pretty clear that these are equally talented. They were described similarly on things like intellect and creative brilliance and technical knowledge and so on, but experienced very differently as leaders. So here's how the creative group was experienced. Now, these are bubble charts, and I don't have time to get into all the data, but blue is a strength, red is a liability. The size of the bubble has to do with how many comments were made about that. So, for example, strong people skills score a 79, personal, approachable, leads by example, passionate, good listener. The whites were the ones that didn't differentiate. In other words, you had to have them, but they were similar in both groups. Red is a liability. They're overworked and overcommitted. Otherwise, look at that scene. Here's the high reactive group. You see some blue, but you see a lot of red. Ineffective interaction style versus strong people skills were the two that topped the list. Micromanages, over-demanding, too self-centric. Raj talked about selflessness. There's a whole set of sub-themes here about the deeper motivation. Much more servant leader, selfless leader than the high reactive group, which was much more self-serving in its drive. Big drive, but self-serving. So, this is how you're seen. Where do you land? Where does your business leadership culture land here? What's built for scaling conscious leadership and a conscious business? This is a big shift. And it's a big deal. And it isn't us saying this. This is a nice theory. This is leaders talking to other leaders saying, here's what you're doing that's working and here's what you're doing that's not working. We just count score. We just count it up. It couldn't be more different. This is not complex enough for scaling your business into VUCA. It's not going to also create a conscious business. Now, we got to thinking about this, and we said, what are leaders telling us? They're actually telling us the conditions that need to be present for scaling leadership, conscious leadership, like a diamond, right? If the right conditions aren't there, the right pressures and depth and tension, heat, whatever, you get a rock, you get coal, you get something, but you don't get a diamond. And so, if we just look at what leaders said, the top differentiators between the most effective and the least effective leaders, well, top of the list was all people skills. So when Raj says people, love them, caring, conscious culture, the best leaders that we see are really, really strong on that. They've learned how to be in relationship at every level of scale, one-on-one, one-on-team, one-on-organization. Talked with Mullally from Ford and Boeing prior to that. He says, love your people, love them up. And so the skills that came out were strong, people skills, good listener, team builder, empowers people, develops people, and so on. Second condition, radical humanity. The kind of leaders that we see really turning their organization around and creating transformations start from, I'm the problem. I'm the one that's got the most to learn here. And they ask for help. We had one leader who took his leadership circle profile one time and then 2 years later took it again and had slipped considerably toward reactive. By the time we met with him 2 days later, he had had 25 meetings with 40 people. He put both profiles out and he asked a simple question. What happened to me and what do I need to do about it? So how do we step into leading knowing that we're part of the problem? We cannot not be. No shame in that. We're in this VUCA world we're all in over our head. How could we not be? So let's get on with it. I got a lot to learn from you. Can you help me? They lead vulnerably, they lead transparently, and it's a radically human approach, and it creates tremendous team relationships. And so it serves the other one, which is deep relationship. And then, of course, it's all oriented toward higher purpose. What matters most? What are we trying to create here? From a deep place of passion and commitment. And that is the fundamental shift from reactive to creative. And that's a condition. If you don't make that shift individually and collectively, what you're trying to boot up is likely not to happen. And then it gets systematized. And so when Raj talks about the integration of stakeholders and the optimization of value for all of them in an interdependent way, this is what we're talking about. How do we design a business together that can do that? And that condition puts everybody in tension. We're all in a development gap, learning together to create the future we aspire to. You put those conditions in place, you're going to scale conscious leadership. This is a big shift. It's a hero's journey. I love the metaphor here. The mythology, the poetic traditions, the spiritual traditions are really clear. This journey is not for the faint of heart. It's heroic. It's a metamorphosis process, because the person who starts the journey is not the one that finishes it. That person dies along the way. When we were kids, we would collect the larvae of some of these big, beautiful moths. And we'd watch them spin cocoons, and then in the winter, we'd open a few of them to see what was going on. And at first, there's a caterpillar, a larva in there. And then a little later, there's nothing in there. There's only goo, some kind of primordial gel. And then form and structure would start to take place, and then out would come a beautiful moth or butterfly. Color, agility, higher perspective, winged life, capable of grace and beauty and speed. This is the promise of transformation, but don't kid yourself, there is a disintegration, reintegration process. That's why when you read the hero's journey story, what happens? Right after they leave on the land, into the land of adventure, he or she gets, bad things happen. Swallowed by a whale. Right? Have to stew in a lot of digestive juice for a while. And so I want to talk about two practices, personal and collective. There are more, but two that I think are right at the heart of transformation. The first is discernment, purpose, and create vision. Conscious leaders are oriented toward higher purpose, period. So how do you get onto that? So I'm in the feed mill going, I'm not becoming who I am. And that started a process. I journal. I went home and started a journal. I called it my must journal. Musts. What must I be about with my life in order to live the life I came here to live instead of someone else's? Warren Bennis wrote a book called On Becoming a Leader, one of the great books of the last century on leadership, where he interviewed hundreds of leaders at the tops of their professions, different professions, and asked them, he wanted to learn about leadership. And it became a book on purpose, largely. He said none of these leaders set out to be leaders. They set out to follow an urge that they could not be about. And it led them into leadership. So here I am writing my must journal, trying to discern this urge. After I was done, I put it away, went about my life. 15 years later, I found it in the attic. Opened it up, started reading, and started weeping. Because everything I'd written was happening in ways I could not have imagined. I didn't know about this profession, and I'm reading here. I want to help people grow and develop spiritually, psychologically. I'm making dog food when I wrote this. Right? Rilke, great German poet, has a poem here that I just think captures the transformative pull of purpose. So as we orient toward higher purpose, it transforms us. It's a transformative agent. It does the work. So he starts this poem. It's a walk on he's looking on way into the sunrise coming, and this is vision and purpose, right? He says, my eyes already touch the sunny hill, going far ahead of the road I have begun. Far ahead of the road I have begun. And so we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. It has its inner light even from a distance and changes us even if we do not reach it. My eyes already touch the sunny hill going far ahead of the road I have begun. Decades, right? Long-term perspective. Far ahead of the road I have begun. And so we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. It has its inner light even from a distance and changes us, even if we do not reach it, into something else which, hardly sensing it, we already are. The butterfly was always in the caterpillar. Hardly sensing it, we already are. A gesture waves us on, answering our own wave, but what we feel is the wind in our face. How do we let ourselves be grasped by what we cannot grasp, by what wants to take and come through our life? How do we do that? It has its inner light, even from a distance, and changes us, even if we do not reach it, into something else which, hardly sensing it, we already are. The hero within, the leader within, is already there, fully present. When Michelangelo in Venice revealed David, people were in awe. They said, "How did you do this?" He said, "Well, David was always in the stone. All I had to do was chip away everything that wasn't David." Now, don't kid yourself. That chipping away can hurt. How do we chip away everything that's not us? All that prior conditioning and play not to lose and fear-based game and so on. How do we let that go and be disintegrated? And that's the work. A gesture waves us on, answering our own wave. I used to think of this as stalking your longing, like a hunter stalks and tracks a deer. How do you stalk your longing? Then I heard Steve Jobs speak at Stanford. Steve was dying when he spoke at Stanford. He knew it. And he talked about leaving college to study calligraphy. Calligraphy. I mean, who'd have thought, what's that got to do with anything? And then you saw what happened when the Mac came out. Hello, in a nice, beautiful font. And artistry in computing was born. He said, looking forward in my life, none of the dots connected, but looking backward, they all connect in ways I never could have imagined. When I look back at my life, even back into the feed mill days and prior to that, I'm astonished by how all the dots connect. Couldn't see them moving forward. Looking back, it's amazing. So now my sense is I'm stalking the longing that's stalking me. It's been stalking me the whole time. And so this practice of discerning purpose and distilling that into vision is a core conscious leadership practice. And then you get the whole organization engaged in it, and you create a mission and a vision that's built on higher purpose. We were working with a senior team recently, a day and a half. They came in with lots of different ideas about where healthcare in this case needed to go in their country, because they knew it was going to get really turbulent and disrupted very soon. And they walked out of there with a vision that stunned them. They're literally staring into each other's eyes with tears going, none of us came in with that. And they knew they could do it. It's going to be a lot of work, but they could do it and really transform healthcare in this country. And so the big questions here, what do you stand for? What do you want your life, your leadership, your organization to stand for? What would you do if you could, if you knew you couldn't fail? What matters most? How do I get that clear and get onto it? Big questions, and you're never done with them. The soul is a jealous lover. You no sooner create something really significant, and then it's like, okay, good, done with that. Now, what's next? I think this process of transformation is getting literate, good at navigating two currents. I use the word literacy because we had to learn literacy, like in a language, A, B, C, or in math, 1 + 1 is 2, and 2 + 2. We had to learn that. Most of us haven't learned the pathways of transformation. We haven't actually been taught the literacy of our own transformation? Well, it's navigating two currents. First, the ascending current, orienting myself on what wants to come through. I think in terms of these stages of development, the first stage is I'm authored by what I've been taught I have to be, and how do I live up to that? That's the socialized. Then we move on into a self-authored place where I'm now focused on a purpose and a vision that matters most, and I'm building a sense of authenticity around that, embodying it as clearly and transparently as I can. And then I think it moves on to being authored by something even larger than me, that wants to come through. And that's a lifelong practice of discerning what matters most. And it will pull you into fear. So the second practice is knowing your doubts and fears. Right? Because as soon as I step up, I get scared. That's how it works for me. The parts of me that are not ready for the journey, not ready for doing all that go at risk, all hit the fan at once. And then we have to work at that. Otherwise, we're responding to them. We're showing up. Well, that's the weather we're bringing, right? And so how do you descend into the small, scared places of your life? We all have them. I have them. I still have them. And so the second place to work is to know your doubts and fears. Get underneath them and see the illusion in them. And so when the last book came out, the first book that we created, I wrote with my partner Bill. Shortly before the book came out, he and I are having an increasingly difficult conflict. And it's really heating up. And of course, I'm in my reactive self, and so it's his fault, right? This is how you solve a problem. You make it the other person's fault, and it's not your problem, right? And that's getting I'm firing off my emails and long histories of how we got to where we are and so on, and I'm not getting anything back. It's like silence back, and it starts to get, not only do I get more angry, but I get more scared, because here we now have two principals that are just about to co-author a book and own a company together, and everybody knows it. Well, at some point, I decide that maybe I have something to learn in this. And so I start working it. I go for a walk. I'd been working it for a while, but on this particular day, it was a cold winter day, and I went for a walk, and I'm out in the middle of the woods, and all of a sudden, I don't know why insights happen when they happen, but it goes kaboom, right to the bottom. And I saw a core belief that I'd never seen before. I am my ideas. These ideas define me. Now that's an outside-in notion. How you see my ideas defines me. So this is me. This book is me. And let's be clear, Bill, it's not you. These are my ideas. Now, how well do you collaborate in a firm that generates IP when it all revolves around you, and you're the kind of master of ideas, right? I saw it. I was like, oh my gosh, I get it. And after I got done throwing up, because it was a big release, I started laughing. Like all this time I've been so angry with Bill at being such an arrogant jerk, and I'm the one that's so arrogant. Wow, look at that. So I go back to my office, I type off a 3-sentence email to Bill. Bill, I've been wrong. Furthermore, I've been wrong in the partnership for a long time. Let's talk. He writes back, I feel your heart, brother. Let's talk. So we met the morning before we did some work with a client, had breakfast, and it was an extraordinary conversation. Mostly me owning up to how I'd been showing up, the weather I'd been bringing, and what I'd learned about how I was still functioning out of a deep reactive place as it relates to my thought leadership. It took our relationship to a whole new level. The level of synergy and ideation and co-creation is just enjoyable. And of course, I think there's some parallel here, but the firm has gone 50% growth ever since. It's released a whole lot of possibility I was holding. So, how do we descend? It's descent in service of transcendence. How do we descend in and drop into our arrogance, our high control, our need to be so liked and admired all the time, the parts of ourselves that are in the way? And get good at that and see the illusion. It's not true. I'm not my ideas. I'm good at ideas. They don't have me, I have them. And as we do that, we open space. We become a more powerful vessel for what wants to come through. And so I label these as positive and negative, not because one's good or bad or whatever, or hard or easy, but because it's like electricity. If we want to turn the lights off here, we just have to disconnect one of the wires. Positive wire and a negative wire. Doesn't matter which one you disconnect, the lights go out. Right? So if we want the lights to go out, all we got to do is disconnect from the ascending current. Lose our way in terms of what really matters. If we want the lights to go out, all we got to do is not do the work of descent in service of cleaning up so that more can come through. Both are necessary. When you put them together, you get real energy to flow. And this is what it means to be self-transforming. And then you become a transformative influence around you. And so the big questions here are, what do I risk? What's at risk for me to more fully step up? If we're going to go and create a conscious business, you better believe a lot goes at risk. The whole way you identify with your current role and the current understanding of leadership, it all is subject to re-evaluation. Your very identity goes at risk. What do you fear most by stepping up? How do you get in your own way? All these are really powerful questions. And if you do that, if you work it, the journey proceeds. Moves from reactive to creative. That's the big shift. From being authored by others, living up to expectations, I am my ideas, your approval defines me, I have to somehow here's what I'm about. Here's what we're about. And then if it moves on, it can actually move into an even higher order operating system, which we call integral. And this is very systemic. You become the servant architect to optimize all the stakeholders and interdependencies around your business. And you're actually working for the larger welfare now. So when Raj talks about we can actually change the world, we can only do that from a much more conscious place than most of our leadership comes from. And you won't create a conscious business or that kind of impact in the world unless you're on the journey and you vulnerably and transparently invite your leadership teams and the organization to come along it with you. That scales leadership. That scales conscious leadership. So the organization will not perform at a higher level of performance than the consciousness of its leadership, and it's a journey. We think consciousness and competence boot up together, that effectiveness and scale and the kind of agile, innovative, adaptive organizational cultures that we're trying to create in order to be more nimble and agile in a VUCA environment only happen from creative or higher levels of leadership. And so I want to close with our mission statement. This is our purpose for the Leadership Circle business. We exist. We exist. We could stop there. It's so friggin' amazing that we're here in a little blue ball falling around a sun in a solar system in the middle of a universe so vast it's incomprehensible. And here we are having a conscious capitalism, right, conference. We exist, and we exist to evolve. I think that's why we're here, personally. We're here to evolve to higher and higher understandings of reality itself, consciousness, effectiveness. We're here to get, right? We're here to evolve. We exist to evolve the conscious practice of leadership, to steward the planet. Raj was unambiguously clear. There's so much at stake here. We're not going to, we have our backs against the wall in the world on a big way. And we only have a chance with more conscious leadership, period. And building more conscious businesses and governments and NGOs. And why? To steward the planet and awaken us all to our inherent unity. The highest levels of consciousness are unambiguously clear, whether it be the Indian tradition or the Western, East, West, North, South. There's only one of us here. We're all each other. Our diversity is just a beautiful dance on a stage of oneness. What if we led from that place where all stakeholders, every one of us, is each other, and we have to create businesses that account for the welfare of all of it? That's really what conscious capitalism is all about. So thank you very much. It's been my privilege to be with you today.